She was one of the last to serve him. Not in the mountain fortress, this time far beneath the dying city. A bunker where the lights never flickered, but hope did. As the Third Reich crumbled above, she carried trays below, watched them unravel, and stood in front of a door no one dared open. Now, nearly a century later, she's telling what was on the other side. But the most disturbing part isn't what was inside. It's what never came out. Berlin smelled of smoke and wet stone. The ground shook often, not from earthquakes, but from what the world called liberation. Inside the bunker, time had stopped, but fear hadn't. Elizabeth Kalhammer didn't expect to end up here. Not after the mountain, not after what she witnessed at the Berghof. She was supposed to be safe, forgotten, silenced. Instead, she was pulled back in, this time to witness the final act. If you're here, it means you're not looking for sanitized history. You want what was hidden, edited, erased. This channel exists for that reason. And if you value stories that were never meant to survive, stories like Elizabeth's, subscribe now. Not for me. For the next truth we uncover, the next archive they forgot to burn. Because what she saw in that last week, beneath Berlin, behind sealed steel, wasn't written in any textbook. And once you hear it, you'll understand why. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Country, city, leave it below. I read every single one. And this time, I want to know who else is standing with her, at the edge of that final corridor. Now, follow me, into the bunker. The summons came without a uniform, just a folded note, delivered by a driver with no name and a coat without insignia. It was the middle of January 1945. Snow still clung to the trees near Salzburg, but the war no longer obeyed the seasons. And Elizabeth, now 20 and trained in silence, understood something unspoken. She was not being rescued. She was being moved. She left without goodbye, escorted in silence past checkpoints that no longer asked questions. From the highlands of Bavaria to the smoking ruins of Berlin, the journey took 2 days and felt like a verdict. No one explained why a former maid from the Berghof was needed in the capital, and no one dared question an order signed by Himmler himself. The capital was barely recognizable, buildings reduced to teeth, roads cracked like dry skin. But somewhere beneath the surface, the regime was still pretending to function. Elizabeth was escorted past rubble and silence to a black door built into the earth. Her name was not on the list, but a voice from within read it out loud anyway, as if expected. Inside, everything changed. The lights were too bright, the air too dry. The corridors below ground were cleaner than any place she'd seen since Salzburg. Polished floors, precise shadows, and the weight of something unsaid pressing against the walls. This wasn't a refuge, it was a theater. And someone had cast her in a role she hadn't auditioned for. The woman who greeted her wore pearls and a blue dress. She spoke gently, but her words were rehearsed. "You'll do what you did before. Nothing more. Nothing less." Elizabeth nodded, but something in her gut stirred. Because what she did before was witness. And now, in the dictator's final sanctuary, there was more to see than anyone wanted remembered. Above ground, the war was no longer a campaign. It was a collapse. Elizabeth saw it through the bullet-pocked windows of the convoy as it entered the capital. Berlin resembled a city devoured by its own history. Buildings reduced to carcasses, smoke rising from cracks in the ground, and silence interrupted only by distant artillery like thunder that had forgotten how to stop. But beneath the wreckage, something remained untouched. The bunker. A structure so deliberate, so over-engineered, that not even the rage of falling regimes could fracture it. It smelled of metal and filtered air. Its walls were lined with maps and faces that still believed the Reich could be reborn from ashes. She was escorted to the lower levels, where uniforms moved without names, and orders were whispered as if the very air might betray them. It was here, in this suffocating calm, that she realized the war was not over. It had simply gone underground. Rooms were labeled in code. Time was measured not in hours, but in who emerged from which door. Elizabeth was not treated as staff, nor as prisoner. She was something else. A presence meant to observe without reacting, to carry trays, polish handles, and remain invisible. But even in invisibility, she felt the weight of being watched. She passed officers with hollow eyes and stiff movements. Men who had once barked commands across Europe now studied walls as if trying to remember what they stood for. Among them, she spotted familiar faces, ones she had seen in the Berghof during late-night meetings that reeked of cologne and fear. They had survived the collapse of the mountain, and now they hid beneath concrete, pretending the world above hadn't already ended. The dictator himself was somewhere below. That much she knew. But no one said his name anymore. Not in full, not out loud. They spoke of him, as if summoning a ghost. And in a way, that's what he had become. Something real enough to obey, yet distant enough to fear. Elizabeth followed corridors that circled themselves like a snake biting its tail. And somewhere deep in that coil of steel and silence, she found the bunker's true purpose. Not as shelter, but as mausoleum for a dream that refused to die cleanly. It was here, in the quietest part of the collapsing empire, that she heard the first rumor. A door, locked from within. No rank, no label, and guarded by men who didn't blink. She appeared like a memory too carefully preserved. Eva Braun, immaculate even underground, moved through the bunker not like a prisoner of war, but like a hostess at a banquet no one dared to leave. Her footsteps were soft, her perfume faint, but her presence surgical. In a place built for collapse, she still performed the theater of control. Elizabeth saw her before she was seen. Carrying linens toward the private quarters, she turned a corner and froze. There Eva stood, head tilted slightly, inspecting a stack of sealed envelopes. She looked up, and for a long second, said nothing. Then, a smile. The kind rehearsed too many times to be warm. "I remember you." The words landed heavier than they sounded. Not as a greeting, but as a confirmation. Not that Elizabeth had survived, but that she had remained silent. Eva stepped closer. Her eyes scanned the lines of Elizabeth's face with clinical care, as if comparing her against a mental photograph taken years earlier. She reached out, gently adjusted the collar of Elizabeth's coat, then said almost tenderly, "You're good at vanishing." Elizabeth didn't reply. She didn't have to. "You were careful. That's why you're here. Only careful people survive this long." There was no threat in her tone, but also no comfort. Just a recognition that in the Reich's final days, silence had become the only currency that held value. Before turning to leave, Eva added one more line. "This place is more fragile than it looks. Just like him." She didn't say who. She didn't have to. Elizabeth stood alone in the corridor for minutes after. The light above her flickered once, then steadied. Somewhere behind that wall, a man the world still feared was wasting into shadow. And beside him, the woman who once arranged flowers at the Berghof was now arranging something else entirely. The performance was still going, but everyone involved knew. The curtain was beginning to burn. She didn't see him for 3 days. His presence was known only by the shift in air, the way the guards stiffened, the way the hallway fell quiet even before footsteps touched stone. Hitler no longer walked with the posture that once filled stadiums. His frame, thinner than she remembered, passed behind doors flanked by silence. Elizabeth caught her first glimpse by accident. A cracked door, a sliver of dim light, and the figure hunched over a table too large for one man. He was writing, not speaking. Page after page, scrawled in bursts, crossed out, rewritten. The sound of the pencil was louder than the man himself. He did not issue commands. He passed notes. His voice, once thunderous in film reels and radio broadcasts, had withered into private ink. These handwritten slips became the new language of the regime's end. Orders, corrections, fragments of a collapsing mind projected onto paper and carried out by those too afraid to question their coherence. Elizabeth was handed one of these notes without explanation, folded in quarters, sealed with wax. She was told to place it on a specific tray, deliver it to a specific room, and leave before anyone else entered. She did as told, but as she turned to leave, she glanced back. The room was empty. The note remained untouched. Outside that chamber, officers argued in whispers about fuel, about tunnels, about the Russians now just hours from the city. But the one name they no longer debated was his. They avoided it, as if speaking it might summon something they could no longer control. The man behind those walls, still feared, still obeyed, was no longer a commander. He was an echo inside a dying system, dictating through paper, isolated in ritual, moving people like pieces on a board he no longer recognized. And those around him played along. Because if the dictator still believed he was in control, then maybe, just maybe, the lie could hold a little longer. But even Elizabeth, trained in silence, knew what that silence was hiding. Not authority, decay. It was the only door in the bunker without a label. No title, no rank, no insignia. Just matte steel, a faint dent near the handle, and 2 guards who never left their post. Elizabeth passed it every morning, every night, always in silence. The hall curved slightly there, as if the architecture itself wanted to obscure its presence. No one mentioned it, not in whispers, not in gestures. It wasn't forbidden. It was erased. A space deliberately removed from the mental map of the bunker. And yet, its existence radiated unease, like a tumor beneath the skin that no one dared name. The guards weren't like the others. Their uniforms bore no emblems. Their weapons were clean, unused. Their eyes didn't move. Elizabeth once dropped a cloth at their feet, a simple test wrapped in accident. Neither man flinched. She picked it up without a word. Some nights, she heard something from behind that door. Not voices, movement, like furniture being dragged, or something heavier. One night, a light flickered beneath the gap for 3 full minutes before going dark. Another night, the smell changed. A faint chemical trace that reminded her of antiseptic and old metal. And then there was the note, left folded in her laundry basket, unsigned, unsealed, but unmistakably official. It read only one sentence: "Do not approach the unmarked door again." She hadn't spoken of it, hadn't touched it, but someone had seen her eyes linger. And that was enough. From that day forward, she changed her path, took longer routes, avoided the corridor unless instructed. But the door remained, silent, watching, present even in its absence. Elizabeth didn't know what was inside, but she understood one thing with painful clarity. Whatever waited behind that steel slab wasn't meant to be found in the ruins. It was meant to survive them. It was delivered at 6:35 p.m., Not a minute earlier, not a second late. The tray, covered in white linen, carried a single place setting. 2 servings, identical in portion, presentation, and silence. One for him, one for her. Elizabeth was not assigned the delivery, but she prepared it. Her hands moved through the motions with trained precision, but her mind wasn't still. She had seen this pattern before. The calm that precedes nothing. The care given not to food, but to ceremony. No one dared call it by name, but everyone in that bunker knew. This was not a meal. It was a conclusion. Boiled potatoes. Simple. Buttered vegetables. Clean. No meat. No garnish. No wine. Only water in 2 clear glasses and a dessert left untouched. The kind of meal that asks nothing of digestion. The kind of meal designed to leave no mess behind. A junior officer took the tray. Young, stiff, pale around the eyes. He did not ask for help. He did not speak. He carried the tray through 3 doors, then disappeared. Elizabeth waited. 24 minutes later, the same officer returned. Empty tray. Same linen. Folded precisely, without a single wrinkle. His face had changed. Not from grief, but from clarity. As if a long-awaited script had finally reached its final page. He walked past her without stopping. That night, the bunker grew quieter than ever. Doors closed with exaggerated care. Voices, when used, dropped to whispers. Eva was not seen again. Her quarters remained lit, but no footsteps echoed from within. Elizabeth did not sleep. Not because of fear, but because she knew whatever came next would be the aftermath of silence. And silence here had always meant one thing. Something was gone. She was instructed not to enter the corridor past the 3rd chamber. The air there had thickened overnight, carrying with it the unmistakable residue of smoke, of chemicals, and something far older. Finality. Elizabeth didn't disobey. She didn't need to. The scent carried its own testimony. Burned fabric. Metal scorched from the inside. Ink scorched into paper. Later, a crate was brought up from that same wing. Heavy. Marked only with the Reich Eagle and a code she didn't recognize. It wasn't filed or documented. It was placed in the war room directly on the center table, surrounded by men who no longer wore expressions of confidence. Inside, she later learned, were fragments. Not of bodies, of doctrine. Shattered frames, handwritten notes, charred seals from personal files. Pages of speech drafts, travel orders, private correspondences. But none were complete. Each had been partially destroyed, some intentionally burned, others soaked through and dried, left unreadable. As if someone had tried to erase not just a man, but the echo of a man. One soldier wept, not for who had died, but for what had been lost. "The world will right it wrong," he said to no one. "They'll think it ended with a bullet." But Elizabeth knew better. It ended in fragments. In decisions made too late. In ideologies no longer defended, only hidden. The bunker wasn't a tomb. It was a furnace, reducing belief to ash and paper. And in that silence, even the ink began to fade. There was no announcement, no broadcast, just a single red light on the bunker's central switchboard that stopped blinking, and never blinked again. Elizabeth wasn't trained to operate the communications hub, but she passed it each day. A wall of dials and cables, manned around the clock by a rotating team of women, instructed to never ask who was on the line. Each switch connected to a post, a command center, a city already in flames. In early April, the cables grew heavier with messages. Desperation began to replace strategy. Voices on the other end no longer barked orders. They begged for clarification. Is the leader alive? Is Berlin secure? Is there an escape route? For a while, the switchboard room became the bunker's pulse. Information passed through it like blood through arteries. But blood stops when the heart stops. And so it did. The night after the final meal, Elizabeth noticed it. The hum was gone. No typing, no shuffling, no chatter through wires. Just a frozen room, all lights dark. One operator sat at her post, headset still on, eyes wide and unfocused, not crying, just listening, or pretending to. Someone had pulled the line. Not a technical failure. An act of erasure. Elizabeth stood silently by the doorframe. She knew what it meant. If the lines were dead, there was no more message, no more image to protect. The regime was no longer trying to outlive itself. It was folding inward, sealing its final breath inside concrete walls. That silence would travel faster than any transmission. And above them, the world was already preparing to decide what story it would believe. There was no farewell speech, no salute, just empty boots by the wall and hallways that no longer echoed with the cadence of authority. Elizabeth noticed it first when serving tea. The tray she carried that morning had been prepared for 6. Only 4 arrived. No one commented. No one looked up. The chairs remained in place, as if waiting for men who had decided never to sit again. By sunset, entire closets had been stripped, coats gone, medals removed. Even the monogrammed cufflinks, once a sign of untouchable rank, had vanished from the usual vanities. Some had fled. Others, she feared, had simply removed the skin of their rank and blended into the air like smoke. In their place came silence, and then a smell. Singeing cloth, oil. And on the far side of the hallway, a box of insignias, torn, melted, burned halfway through, left beside the boiler with nothing but a scorched rag to cover it. No ceremony, just disposal. The transformation wasn't theatrical. It was cowardly. The same voices that once declared eternal loyalty now hid behind false names and forged documents. Guards exchanged their coats for kitchen linen. Officers grew beards, let their hair fall, switched languages mid-sentence. Within a day, uniforms were no longer uniforms. They were liabilities. Even the dogs had stopped barking. Elizabeth moved through the bunker with caution, her tray lighter each hour, her steps quieter. She passed corridors where portraits had been ripped from frames, where flags were folded not in honor, but in fear. The Reich had not been overthrown. It had slithered out of its own skin. And in its place stood men still trying to decide whether to die for their leader or to vanish before his name became poison. History would not remember them all, but Elizabeth did. When Elizabeth finally left the bunker, there were no witnesses, no orders, no ceremony. The corridors that had once throbbed with authority now echoed only with her footsteps. She carried nothing in her hands, yet something heavier than any crate followed her out. Memory. Not of speeches or battles, but of silence. Silence that had swallowed uniforms, erased names, and sealed a door that should never have existed. That door, the one without a name, remained her burden. The guards had vanished. The switchboard was dead, and the uniforms had dissolved into smoke. But she remembered the hum behind that steel, the faint light beneath it, the weight of a presence the Reich had tried to hide even from itself. The bunker had consumed its master, yet something inside that door refused to be consumed. For decades, she said nothing. She let the world believe in neat endings, poison, fire, finality. But the truth she carried was jagged. The dictator had collapsed, but not alone. His fortress in the mountains had hidden fear. His bunker in Berlin had hidden decay, and that door had hidden something else, something she never named, because names survive. Silence, she thought, might not. When she reached her 90s, silence no longer felt like protection. It felt like complicity. So she spoke, first of the fortress, then of the bunker, and finally of the door. She did not describe what she glimpsed inside, only the certainty that it was meant to outlast him. That knowledge stayed with her like a shadow stitched to her spine. It shaped her nights, her dreams, the weight of her bones. She had survived, but survival came at the price of carrying what should have perished with the Reich. Her last confession did not rewrite the war. It reframed it. She reminded the world that power doesn't only collapse in flames. Sometimes it lingers in silence, in ash, in rooms sealed too well. That was the story she took with her. Not a legend, not a myth, but an unfinished sentence the world pretended was complete. And now, it is ours to carry. Before we close, I want to ask something of you. If you felt the weight of Elizabeth's story, if you believe that voices like hers matter precisely because they were never meant to survive, then subscribe. By doing so, you gain access to stories rarely told, fragments of history that expose what silence tried to bury. We are close to reaching a milestone that will allow these testimonies, these analyses of fear, survival, and even the nightmares that followed to keep coming alive here. Your support makes that possible, and it ensures that these truths don't fade into the same silence Elizabeth fought against. So, let me leave you with this. She walked out of the dictator's final refuge with nothing in her hands, but everything in her memory. And tonight, part of that memory belongs to you.